I was asked to show some images, but I'll do this talk without images today. Thank you, Jens, and I'd like to thank Jens Hoffman and the Jewish Museum for providing the opportunity to speak today and for getting me out of Istanbul. And I first met Jens, I think it was a station or an airport mall or train station. I just cannot recall, but I think it was on the way out of Kassel in 1997, right after Documenta 10, and I was extremely glad at that time to meet someone who was at least as prickly as I am. And then we did a few projects together. I think it was Institution Square in Helsinki, where Jens invited 10 institutions from Europe to do quite experimental projects at Chiasma. And then, of course, next Documenta should be curated by an artist that was also with eFlux. And I should say right out that I don't think the work I do is unorthodox. It's in fact deeply rooted in history and institutionalism, while at the same time it may be regarded as unorthodox from the vantage point of practices that do not harbor any doubts about the reasons of their existence. I would say our imperative is not to be novel, radical, or cutting edge. In fact, these feel more like formalist concerns and the use of the institution for personal gain. What we resist is the spectacular, the privatization and theme parkization of social life, and turn our compass more to a democratic project. As Chantal Mouffe suggests, our larger objective is transforming institutions into a terrain of contestation of the hegemonic order. The museum world, I'm going to talk about what Jens decided not to talk about. The museum world has been marketized since almost the last 40 years. It's a well-observed condition locally and globally. But what is particular to my interest is that this world has been increasingly embedded in network of relationships that preclude public purview. That is to say, it has become a pre-public or post-public realm with dispositions or the residue presented to plebeian consumption. While the results appear to be similar, the processes through which decisions are being taken have been privatized in a self-affirming global network of private and public contexts alike. The residue. The residue in the form of exhibitions, programs, can be compared to the leftovers of a sumptuous feast. The public makes do happily with what they have never seen before and gorges on the leavings. But the guests have already left the table and the party is taken somewhere else. This model of the institution is more in alignment with the diegesis of the industrial fair rather than one history of the museum as a bourgeois ideal of democracy in education. If the industrial fair is one narrative that has come to shape new museum ideas, the other is the theme park. Its eyes are set squarely on a tourist class that keeps on swelling with the incorporation of new audiences from India, China, Sub-Sahara, and Southeast Asia. I'd say that the big cash players in main cities have already accommodated many aspects of the industrial fair and the theme park. This is what I name powerless socialization. Powerless socialization is an experience that has all aspects of a notion of a publicum. People congregate in the new agoras by their own volition. However, their participation in such spaces are defined either by a purely broadcast model or pitiful performance of controlled inclusivity. But that people congregate and get around in these spaces hardly ever evolve into something or anything constructive. These will not be the places of the beginning of a new democracy. These will not become agoras or places of mobilization. These will not be offered the tools towards self-determination. They will not be offered the tools towards self-determination. But it's a beautiful space. It often summons a tour de force architecture. It will be instantaneously branded as such. It's a place coextensive with the leisure and tourism sector. Consumer exposure is sublimated by brand recognition. Such a model, in order to survive, requires non-stop real estate expansion and construction. This model does not embody a single paradox. It will be the reticulation of the same artists and architectural names, works indistinguishable from each other, from one institution to another, and narrative hierarchies must be more or less accommodating each other. Meanwhile, museums outside branded cities keep on unraveling. It is a dire script. Their locatable historical support class has dissolved along with the civic sector. The new support class is not grounded. It's unhinged from time and space, and often looks only to London, New York, LA, and other power corridors, and will park the stock or their talents, or talenta, if you will, wherever it desires. It did not take a genius to forecast this historical transformation of second cities spinning into crises. It was nevertheless too hard to surrender to the inevitable for any subject born into a welfare state thinking that the hell we live in today was momentary. Instead of introducing and testing out different methods for their institutions, many institutions prefer to remain obstinate to the challenges, effectively subjecting themselves into increasingly anemic conditions and insolvency. At the same time, the administration of the museums began to change. When managers begin to administer institutions as if they're companies, those who don't care for the soul of the institutions, just like hospitals or universities, they are subjected to the same managerial logic. As our colleague David Elliott had once remarked, management had become elevated as a skill in itself that has no relation to any particular discipline or knowledge. I would claim that the core issue here is that the public museum is a non-capitalist institution inserted in turbo-capitalism. The average lifespan of a private company does not exceed 50 years, but the public time is not supposed to be finite. It's supposed to be more or less infinite. The museum will soon become 300 years old or older than most countries, most economic or political systems. Now, new management is supposed to translate into a reduction of expenses and increase in efficacy. It also means monetarization of certain assets and conversion of others to liabilities. Reduction of costs leads to smaller research and curatorial departments, increased outsourcing, increase in efficiency, which open way to massive institutional blunders. Bloated development departments, and then asset analysis leads to skyrocketing loan and service fees and heedless deaccession. This paradigm shift means simply handing over the institution to contemporary desire, one that privileges the present time, the moment, over any other moment. Institutions have sought strategies to delay their demise through mergers, takeovers, brand expansion, administrative centralization, streamlining, divestiture of assets, or asset capitalization. Unfortunately, some of the managerial reconditioning ends up in an ingest or more of the poison that got them sick in the first place. The point is not simply the survival of an institution. That's not the question. It's about rethinking the institution's offer and keeping it germane through these times. A survivalist attitude without a core mission makes them more vulnerable to tribal interests. Tribal interests are in the business of leverage. Short-term panacea could be tantamount to turning them into zombie institutions. In short, when museums with a public service mandate enter as non-capitalist institutions in the late capitalist economy, they enter a field where they have no public endorsement and have to abide by the protocols of instant assessment, short-term efficiency, becoming servants of the moment in which they operate. The kernel of the problem lies in the tension between these economic models and the way the historical public institution and contemporary capitalism have completely different ideas of what public good constitutes. The museum world is being increasingly encircling power corridors. Power corridors are for me the kind of places where energy and arms market crystallize, where financial markets form the outer shell. Consider me bitter, but why is that power corridors are given the luxury of revisionist artistry in our museums? Places and institutions that do not fall in the category of the spectacular dip below the network radar get phased out of presiding narratives. Medium-scale institutions keep on disappearing. Art centers, ICAs, Kunstvereins, they have less traction than before. The middle keeps on dropping because of an increased demand for large-scale institutions. Smaller operations are in places that are not supposed to be occupied in reach. They are not tooled to accommodate branded projects or complex sponsorship schemes. The middle continues to evaporate or is forced to scale up under intensely privatized and competitive cultural spheres. It also drops off because sponsorship is furtively directed to institutions with brand value. We know that the museum is not what it once was, what it used to be, but it has not in general developed into rewarding frameworks. There are still too few institutions that do not merely act as the quiescent platforms of their time. No longer the eternal institution on par with the church and the parliament on a public square, the last 35 years has seen more than a measured transformation. The public and the museum of 250 years plus has been descaled as part of an epistemic shift. It is both harder and easier to institute in these times in view that the normative blueprint has become inoperable. It is wiser to ask broad questions and manage the ebbs and flows with their users, trusting that things can take care of themselves. One cardinal rule for a new institution would be incorporating and welcoming contradictions and failures. Another is to develop a culture that looks at things from different disciplines, incorporating an academic discourse and the public. There is also the need to welcome new tools that enable the public imaginary to flow into and eventually help transform the institution. The task is to address visitors who are not ready and captive audiences, and who are certainly and rightfully doubtful of museums in which there are no narratives that incorporate them. The task is also to denaturalize institutions' presumed authority and understand that its presumption has to be reasoned and disputed. It is essential to not simply utilize, but invent new tools and agencies, releasing the burden of being location-specific, to be frank about controlling the levels of institutional transparency, and not use the language of a royal plural. In short, if the institution can no longer be public because of its bylaws or whatnot, how does it become public? The point is not to interpret the world, but to be in it and accept the consequences of a co-ownership. The exhibition experience is reduced today to the visitation of neo-sacrosanct edifices of star tickets. Such experience is not about the actualization of a bona fide civil society. It, in fact, hinders it, and it actually reduces the potential of activating culture's capacity in helping shape a society. Starting at the end of the 1970s, museums have been participating in an economic condition of perpetual deprivation. Like healthcare and education, they had not been structurally immunized against the volleys of turbo-capitalism. As a result, they've been engaged in an increasingly cynical exhibition sphere with large experience management departments and brand peddling to save the moment, effectively turning themselves into representative institutions for their time. Panhandling to the elite, we have become, in short, clumsy neoliberal characters. And their alternatives, the efficient outposts built from scratch by the elites, the oligarchs, fare way better. Looking at it from another angle, private or public initiative is not the question as long as the overwhelming concept is about a passive receiver, an audience, a viewer, or a visitor that lacks the capacity, the tools, and the agency to articulate its desires. This power-based lack of communication between the institution and its outside needs a rethink. The outside does not have a place for its desires to be recognized. Seamless spaces are offered between the customer and the provider in a charade of market-tested exhibitions, as the possible public is extracted from the equation and replaced by managerial quantification. I've been adamant about institutional time. It is essential to recognize that we move in three temporalities: Our programs perform in the present time, but the museum carries at the same time an ever unresolved past as a heritage machine and an imagination for possible futures. I'll come back to this later. Exhibitions are inherently fugitive, imperfect, fragile models. They're not the most efficient structures for telling stories. The time-based condition enhances the consumption process of the short shelf life. The constant programming deem ideas obsolete before they're exhaustively unpacked. In short, late capitalism exhibition model is about being present in the contemporary as opposed to being contemporary. In the 20th century, there were times when museums were able to dispute and buck the systems that supported them, but they were at the same time tied to these very systems. That was recognized as a role of culture in its institution within a civic democratic project. The question for today is how production, mediation, and dissemination can be redemocratized, and what effects would that have on our museums? Would such a dispositive propel us to rethink the institution's role in society? What do we deal with? At SALT, we actively attempt to cushion the impact of a vociferous market and disregard most of what seems to be in, what is acknowledged as exceptional, or peddled to a kitsch cognition. A history of the titles of exhibitions compared to many other institutions revealed even that difference of mentality. Vacation, the colony of the city. How did we get here? A century of centuries. Every inclusion is an exclusion of other possibilities. I mean, these kinds of titles wouldn't ever go through the development departments. The titles more or less aim to be counterintuitive, odd, rough on the edges, and challenging ever so slightly. I always claim that we like to program for people who are much more intelligent than us, because we don't believe that people are simple-minded. Given the tools, they're amazingly crafty in making collective decisions, and that the institution's attitude to their audiences are often preachy. At SALT, we exercise what we call, when we begin a project, the state of unknowing. That being said, we're not a Q2O museum in full accord with the business of cozy collectivity, creating economy, and all that kind of stuff. For us, the idea is to enter an agonistic sphere where difficult questions can be posed without being incriminating or being hostile. We don't like to provoke, but we like to ask the questions. Now, we're lucky because our life is easier because SALT is not an artwork collection-based institution. Since we have considerable luxury at looking at objects without their routine handicaps. Focusing upon research and treating what we work with potentially as discursive objects, SALT becomes more involved in the actualization of their capacity. As such, the question is not about custodianship, but designing novel narratives and telling multiple stories of art and not one story. We believe that history is not fixed, that any attempt to invent a canon is delusional or authoritarian, or both delusional and authoritarian. I would not say this in another city, but in New York, the context being what it is, with not only extremely powerful market players equipped with significant knowledge, but also major cash players, throws a spin on the curve unlike any other city. Hence, I do not envy most aspects of the jobs of my colleagues who work in this great city. What we can do at SALT is at least put forth an argument to be explored, refuted, or upgraded without the usual rollbacks. As Jun-Mo Kang had said, the objective of the work is to become the object of a discussion. In continuing with the treatment of objects and things, SALT has from its very beginnings disengaged from the curatorial. We do not have curatorial positions. The way we work acknowledges the curatorial figure neither as an auteur class nor as a classical keeper. SALT's dispositive is to visualize research in what we have been calling a post-curatorial approach, where different subjectivities from the professional, academic, or purely interested or curious are interested and assembled around the project. The result does not quite look the same, but more importantly, how we get to conceive a project is different. SALT staff is assembled under the broad rubric of research and programs, where from the web editor to the director, people work all together in a singular space of open access. We question the compartmentalized master plans from the very beginning. As Georgi Kepes had written, ignorance, inertia, but mostly fear that we may be forced to give up vested interests has kept us from pooling our knowledge. While we are not nowhere near where we can, dismantling the obtuse results of departmental arrogance was a place to start. It's not only semantics. We actively engage with art and other things from non-discipline limited angles and attempt to make informed decisions based on rigorous, independent, and open research. If you cannot link your work with a prerogative of thinking beyond the purely monographic, chronological, medium-bound, and such approaches, you cannot proactively create different frameworks, period. Without these frameworks, we cannot invent models that are faithful to art and its practices. We have to be open to incorporating contradictions into our discussions, as there's nothing more than a non-striated, smooth space. There's nothing more dangerous than a non-striated, smooth space. Diversity and being open about your lack of competency even in any interdisciplinary project is a sine qua non. SALT is not a contemporary art space. We haven't divorced the institution from it, believing that despite all of the problems with the art world, some of it still maintains a potential core. We try to approach it differently, as I think any sensible institution is trying to do. SALT is a research institution with a foundation in economic and social history, built environment, visual practices, with a broad range from the late 19th century to the present. Research is made public through exhibitions, talks, and other programs. How did it begin? A strategic project began at the end of 2006 to expand the activities of Platform Garanti Contemporary Art Center, the Ottoman Bank Research Archives, and Garanti Gallery. These were three small to medium-scale institutions with different specialties supported by the same Turkish bank. I was running Platform Garanti at the time. I convinced our funders that all three institutions had to be terminated in the process. In 2011, a new institution called SALT was built on their foundations. SALT means just the thing itself, the thing without the extras. The experience of collapsing into three institutions that had respectively addressed a range of interests from architecture to economic and social studies was akin to leveling completely the compartmentalization of and discipline-based practices. It was comparable to drafting a new model that eradicates from the museum framework the departments of painting and sculpture, prints and drawings, photography, film and video, and such. In short, it was a tremor. If compartmentalization was a bad idea to start with, it had become entrenched and with an obtusely arrogant professional jargon over the many decades. While non-medium specific departments have been no-brainers for a very, very long time, the anxiety is real. As we know, some institutions have to introduce intercuratorial positions, others offer stopgap measures, but at the end, departmentalization must disappear. In short, SALT provides a unique climate where different sets of knowledge clash and benefit from each other without any arrogance. I always believe that the desire to build a museum in the 21st century stems from an inferiority complex. It may be an arrivist concept, it may be self-orientalizing, it is certainly not very original. When we expanded from our small capacities to a larger pool of common resource, we decided not to grow in an evolutionary manner. Instead, we redefined the institution for the 21st century and refused to repeat the mistakes of the past to reconfigure it for the future. What kind of people do we want to grow with? How do we shape a new reality? Hence, incrementalism was not allowed. A colleague made a great remark in an interview in 2009 during our expert discussions that perhaps articulate what I'm trying to say best. Marcus Novak said, "You can look at evolution as fitness, which is a sort of an industrial way of understanding it. Or you can look at it as diversity. And it's much more interesting to figure out the mechanism for producing diversity, which requires the fostering of mutations. They can be applied culturally to the functioning of an institution or to the content of what's shown, what's created for the purpose of not fixing categories, but constantly producing new ones, trusting that the rest of culture will take care of it, fix it." Our discussion had entered on interdisciplinarity, and Novak's metaphors about the evolutionary and industrial model could be taken as a kind of trying to achieve purposefully limited excellence. That is to say, places with unremarkable thresholds where pretty much nothing is unanticipated. It is somewhat unfortunate that most people working in non-Western contexts choose to emulate Western models of the museum. To pursue a model that had been invented years before for a context to be translated without a stipulation for a new social and cultural context is, to say the least, odd. It seems that condition of coloniality has outlived colonialism. From our very beginnings, we have been thinking of the concepts of users, communities of interest, professionalized audiences, constituencies, as opposed to terms such as audience, customers, visitors. Not that all cannot exist concurrently within an institution, but we cannot be a different thing for everyone. I said earlier that there's a power-based lack of communication between the institution and its outside, and that outside, whatever that designation may be, does not have the place for its desires to be recognized, or that if it should be desiring at all. In short, how do the users take a place at the table? Unfortunately, we don't have tools that enable our audiences. They are to be invented. And for the long haul, our research interest is to direct the institution with its constituencies with their support. One cannot achieve that overnight. So we're slowly moving from a broadcast institution into something that develops intelligence with its users, with its collective intelligence, if you will. For the audience to become embedded and active, one needs organic interfaces and trust and caring for. Our question is the following. What are the strategies for ethical and non-hegemonic agencies and communal conviviality? I will look back to this later, as we need to extend this counter-empowerment to the democratic project and to the kind of world that we want to live in. At SALT, our benchmark is not the mass media, it's not the headcount, it's not the occult methods of data aggregation. We don't estimate the public's presence through such parameters. SALT is interested in genuine reactions and how our projects are translated into curricula in the universities, how it moves people out of their slumber to look at the world differently and work differently. We like to assist people with the hope that they become more hopeful, more intrigued, more prone to making informed decisions, and we like to do this without being preachy or talking down while in an engagement with them. SALT does not have a hegemonic desire to address each and every unprivileged person or group. And military technology, like target audiences, have long been eliminated from our vocabulary. What SALT instead does is engage in discussions and platforms for debate that reach beyond the traditional support bases, perhaps with the hope that engagement with different segments of society will turn some of them into constituencies and consuls and translators into their communities. There is a developing taxonomy of embedded institutions that SALT collaborates with, like collaborations, hosting, or simply space allocation. At different levels of visibility, these institutions could be working groups released from the university due to their politics that do not align with the government, NGOs like Change.org or documentary film festivals, performance groups, human rights, and LGBT associations. Hence, the cultural social, and civic education is realized in a wider perspective. Now, we cannot benchmark that. What time do we work in? I mentioned earlier that the institutional time is not the present, and that being present in the contemporary does not make one contemporary. Let me digress here a little bit and extend the constituencies argument to perhaps a bit more healthier level. We have to be transparent and opaque simultaneously. Most amazing contributions to public thinking were fermented, tested, and negotiated away from the threatening gaze of the order, Philistinism, and the popular. Hence, an institution is much a monastery, as it's a church, but not a church looking like a monastery or a monastery looking like a church. Transparency and opacity must not overlap. Hence, the time in which we work is in a trajectory of a past and a future. We persist on supporting operations that are not necessarily visible to the public. We act in the present time, as I say, we bear a past as the heritage machine, but we also offer an inspiration for the future. Coming back to what I said earlier, this means that we have three different publics to account for, to nourish and to take care of. There is a contemporary public, but there is a public that lurks from the past, that will not go away, and there's a future public. So the institution designates three kinds of publics, all locked into a singular moment. This singularity does not privilege the moment, but any decision we make in the moment affects all three temporalities. As Walter Benjamin had written, if the past insists, it's because of life's unavoidable demand to activate in the present the seeds of its buried futures. It would be absurd to claim that any program can be assessed in its complexity in the moment of its actualization. This is not murky relativism, honoring each subjectivity because it just exists. It's about retaining an integrity with the decisions you make when you run the institution. These are the things that matter most, and that managerial assessment will inevitably fail to register. At SALT, we do not have advisors or advisory boards. Fixed-term-based advisors are often motivated, nepotistic, and they play each other in particular ways. Advisory structures with people from similar disciplines are, I find, of little use. Advice without responsibility for the outcome is often irresponsible. Instead, SALT has used from its very beginnings what we call expert discussions, one-on-one sessions with different sorts of professionals from the humanities, architecture, museum world, and we do not discuss the institution directly, but invite people to actively participate with us in co-creating programming, empowering them as creative agents, culture producers, and people for whom we become hopefully a compelling partner. A critic had written on SALT that it attempts to realize the kind of multidisciplinary research-based practice that normally individual artists, collectives, and short-lived art centers have been able to pursue. I'd really appreciated this message, as it spoke to one of our goals of thinking of the institution as a flotilla of individual boats, rather than a transatlantic. SALT is shaped by this multiplicity of experiments and ideas, its failures and relative successes. The institution's amorphous interests, unbound by medium-related chronological or departmentalized concerns, was somehow woven together unpresumptuously. There is an artistic culture that permeates the place without having always to deal with art. The question we started with in 2007 and when we opened in 2011 is now some kind of history. During those years, Islamofascism was not in ascendancy, business was profitable, and Turkey used to smell good. However, to put things in perspective, some of our questions were, what should a future institution look like? What should it be? Can we scale up without yielding to fame and fake and blockbusters? Can we retain the agility? We did not want to run SALT in a centralized manner. The guiding ideas, the motivation and the spirit and the collaboration should be close to each other, but they shouldn't be run from a singular place. We thought about a certain ecology of things. For instance, how to have a wall system that does not require repainting all the time, or how we don't do constant waste production for each project. Because we seek a truly interdisciplinary dialogue, the absence of a more pristine commercial gallery environment allowed us to open the field and understand our buildings as tools for working collaboratively. It's all about stimulating curiosity, and curiosity is not disciplined. At SALT, we prefer exhibition and graphic designers, or really anyone who is involved in our projects, to enter into a relationship with a context that is more based on the process and less on the objects displayed. It is not something that we plan in anticipation, but I would say that's a side effect of the relationship we establish with our collaborators. The architecture of the buildings as well was a case in point when we worked with different younger architectural groups from Turkey, with one coordinator, to find the right ecology for each function, to foster new design concepts, and most importantly, undo a streamlined corporate model. This extended to our identity system, which is an ongoing curatorial program that was initiated by projects. The 4 letters, SALT, S-A-L-T, are marks in SALT's custom design typeface, Kraliçe. SALT disperses its name with the language it uses every day, and at certain intervals, a designer is invited to reimagine the letters, and the identity is adjusted across all media, with only the website automatically archiving each transformation. So it's an institution without a brand or a logo. Let's pursue this discussion of the late capitalist institutional model as being present in the moment, and just a bit further. At SALT, when we actually finish a project, the idea of finishing a project remains somewhat problematic. Exhibitions are inherently fugitive, imperfect, fragile. However, this time-based consumption of the exhibition enhances the consumption process of the short shelf life. The constant programming deem ideas obsolete before they can be seriously unpacked. Here's the main issue we're obliged to perform. It's a demand and an obligation to be in the relentless rhythm and speed of exhibition consumption. Projects are like goods on the market shelf. They have sell-by dates, and when completed, and lo and behold, another institution pursues a similar project, the customary response would be, well, we've done that. Is this the way to go? Or can we, and I want to stress our existential condition once again, should we, as non-capitalist institutions, be competing in a turbo-capitalist society? Instead of becoming representative institutions all the time, can we be reflecting on this time itself? The exhibitionary paradigm does not have to comply to this death wish, this immolation. We can expand the time frames, produce post-programs, release publication months and even years after the project. We serialize exhibitions in the form of what we call modern essays, establish year-long exhibition series as if they are radio plays. We go at issues again and again from different angles. And all of this is done not in a grand sense of a historical correction, but as prototypes for producing new subjectivities, hoping that the rest of the culture takes care of it, uses it, plays with it, and develops it. This is in accordance with our political position that art and consequently exhibitions are not for everybody. We are not for the masses. That is to say, we cannot be interested in an entity that has no shape, that cannot be abstracted or voiced. But we are extremely interested in anybody that we can enter a discursive, agonistic, supportive discussion with. And we can see in clear terms that through our projects, contemporary communities are being produced, nurtured, and even revisited. Having said all of this, the institution's support base in terms of attendance has seen a phenomenal rise over the last 4 years. Thank you.